Hey everyone, my name's Dan Straker. I'm the Resilient Waters Project Manager. I work for Makeway. Here today to talk all about all the work that Resilient Waters has been doing. Last time we had one of these was a couple of years ago, so it's been a little while. And excited to have you all here and hear about all the cool stuff we've been up to. We're going to be whipping through presentations today because there's a lot to get through. So here we go. I want to start by acknowledging I'm sitting here on the unceded lands of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. And I welcome you all to introduce yourselves in the chat and add the name of the nations and lands and territories you're sitting on. And just take a moment to reflect on what the topics we're talking about today relate to First Nations people, the Lower Mainland, or what we call now the Lower Mainland. And just to say that this overlapping effects of flooding and the salmon crisis that's being experienced have really disproportionate impacts on First Nations people. And many First Nations were forcefully displaced during the 1800s and early 1900s and put in harm's way on the floodplain, seen here in yellow. And it's estimated that more than 90% of reserve lands across Canada are located in flood-prone areas, and this is certainly the case in the Lower Fraser Watershed, and it's an ongoing issue. So I just want to acknowledge that from a settler perspective as part of our talk today. Just to give everyone an overview of our agenda here. We've got a very quick welcome, and then we'll have presentations from a slew of people. That won't be the first pun of the day. We've got Lina on the origins of resilient waters and the connected waters update from Watershed Watch Salmon Society, Patrick Lilley from Kerr Leidal Consulting Engineers on restoration projects, Mike Pearson, biologist at Pearson Ecological, on the results from site assessments at 26 flood infrastructure sites from 2021 to 2024. We'll do some Q&A at that point and a bit of a break. And then we'll jump into a presentation from Zack Sherker from the UBC Pacific Salmon Lab on fish passage at a bunch of floodgates in the Coquitlam River. And we have lots of exciting things to share there. And then Scott Hinch, the lead of the UBC Pacific Salmon Lab, will be presenting on a new research project about fish passage at Pumpstations. Then Deb Carlson from West Coast Environmental Law will talk about the Floodplains Coalition, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but it's essentially oriented around some systems change work for flood resiliency in the Lower Mainland. Then we'll do some more Q&A, and at about 12 o'clock, for those that are feeling brave or keen to hop into a conversation, we'll be having breakout discussions on all of the above. So with that, just a quick reminder, because this is all about I know we're not in person today, so we're not seeing each other's faces as much, but it is helpful for everyone to know who's in the room. So if you could rename yourself with your org, that would be great, or the group that you most identify with. The way you can do that is finding your face in the group or in the participant list, and then looking for that little 3-dot button. And throughout the day, encourage you to toss your questions and comments into the chat, or even just like encouraging statements or anything like that is welcome. And to start us off, just going to pop up a little poll to also kind of give everybody a sense of what kind of org you're each working for. This is just a quick one. And what topic is of most interest to you. So if you could direct your attention to the window that's just invaded your screen, and then I will be able to show off the results. Okay, we almost have everyone in here. I think that's going to do it. Okay, so we can see here we've got quite a few folks from local and regional government and provincial and federal, most represented today, smattering across the sectors. That's great. And then the topics of interest, also an even more distribution, an even distribution across. So this will help to inform how we set up for the breakout rooms later today as part of the reason I ask. So that's good to know. We've got a good even split. Without further ado, I'm going to send it along to Lina Azeez to share a little bit about the origins of resilient waters and give us an update on connected waters. Over to you, Lina.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Dan, for getting us started. Just want to say I do recognize a number of people who are attending today, so apologies if some of this is already something you've already heard before, but I'll keep it snappy. So as Dan mentioned, my name is Lina Azeez. I'm Habitat Programs Director at Watershed Watch Salmon Society. Watershed Watch is a salmon conservation organization. Our home waters really is the Coquitlam watershed here in the Lower Fraser, where that is a territory of the Coquitlam Nation and KC as well. So I will talk briefly about the Connected Waters campaign, or a project campaign, and some of the work we have done and some of what's led to the kind of led to the Resilient Waters project and a number of other things we'll be talking about today. You might be quite familiar with our map, but this is our new and improved version that just came out a couple of months ago, where initially we had looked at just the impacts of flood control infrastructure on the Lower Fraser. We then expanded the scope based on a number of other parts of work that we've been involved with to look really at the Lower Mainland. So roughly from Hope to the Salish Sea and down to the border. This map really kind of overlays the issue or summarizes the issue that we are talking about today. So what we did here is identified the number of waterways that are impacted by flood control structures, be those pump stations or gates in particular, anything that's impacting the movement of fish from the main stem of the Fraser or the Boundary Bay area into side channels, tributaries, and sloughs. The reason we did this is because, surprise, surprise, as many of you know, the Lower Fraser is crucial salmon habitat. And in our case, we're interested in the needs of juvenile outmigrating salmon, specifically Chinook and coho, who love to pop into these slow-moving side channels, tributaries, sloughs, as they seek refuge from rushing freshet waters or floodwaters. And it's also it's a really important time in their lives where they learn to become better hunters and they grow bigger. So the longer they have time in freshwater before they make their way out into the ocean, the better chance they have of surviving that out in the ocean and then returning. So much of these waterways, as I mentioned earlier, overlay with where we have built our flood infrastructure over the last 150 years as part of the goals of settling the land, developing the land, agriculture, and all of that. So as we know that much of this infrastructure is now aging and outdated and in need of upgrades, we think this is a great time to be considering a number of other benefits that could be gained from looking at flood management in a different way. So what we found through some research is that we didn't do the research, this is DFO back in 1999, found that 85% of wetland and floodplain habitat has been lost in the Lower Fraser, in the Lower Mainland. And what we found through this mapping exercise is that over 1,700 kilometers of salmon habitat is blocked by at least 186 pieces of flood control structures. And we have some pictures of what that looks like. So to put in context, the whole main stem of of the Fraser River is about 1,400 kilometers. And in the low mainland alone, the amount of habitat we're looking at is about 1,700 kilometers impacted. So this is all really important, overwintering, rearing, and even spawning habitat for salmon. And just so we're all on the same page about what these structures might look like, in the regions, we have roughly 600 kilometers of dikes, about 500 floodgates, and about 100 pump stations. And much of these structures, as I mentioned earlier, are aging, old, kind of breaking down, and really we need to be looking at new ways of managing for floods, because really we cannot build our way out of this problem. And the line the sentence at the bottom of these pictures kind of summarizes why it is an incredibly prohibitively expensive thing to do. Yeah. And our solutions that are, we need to look at solutions that are not dependent on managing infrastructure that is essentially an infinitely recurring future liability. Lots of solutions do exist and will be shared throughout this presentation. So what do we want? What we want to do is reconnect and restore vital salmon nursery habitats in the lower Fraser that have been cut off by flood infrastructure. So that's something that we bring as Watershed Watch to this table. And we want to make sure that these waterways are fish friendly, so we have less fish getting chewed up by pump stations and more fish being able to safely move through these structures. And the solutions do exist, and we want to see more of those being adopted in the region. And we want to do this, of course, in a way that keeps our communities safe. We have about over 300,000 people who live in the floodplain. And just based on recent events from 2021 November, we understand what the impacts are if we don't plan ahead. So how do we try to do this work? We're all about the systems change thing. So, you know, it's bottom up, it's top down, it's all of the above. And we do that through a number of different ways. So we try to focus our attention on advocacy and gaining political support for this. So it's through education, getting people out on the water to see what some of the issues are, getting students out to learn about flood infrastructure, because let's all agree, flood infrastructure is not always the most exciting thing in the world. However, when we start to see the amazing benefits or the ways we can, like how intersectional this work can be, it is actually really, really interesting to dig into further. We are pushing for stable and sustainable funding for this work. As I mentioned, this work is really, really expensive. We do public education. So these are through attending webinars like this, attending and providing lectures at universities, getting people out on the land, and even through our social media channels, because that is, of course, one of the main ways people learn and get news these days. And we participate in cross-sector engagement opportunities as well. All of this work has been backed up by a number of studies that have been done locally, and things that have happened, things we've been learning about from across the world as well. So I just want to say that this work is backed up by a lot of previous studies and ongoing work, which will be shared after I present. I just also wanted to remind people, everybody, about some work that we did back in 2017 with the UVic Environmental Law Center, where we actually did a bit of a legal review, looking at what are some of the legal levers that exist that could help us move this work forward in a more effective and efficient way. And a lot has changed since 2017, some of it obviously in very good ways. So this legal review probably needs a bit of an update, but I did want to mention that at the federal and provincial levels, there are certainly a lot of levers that can be pulled. In particular, under the Fisheries Act, the new and updated Fisheries Act, the management of existing facilities and structures is one policy under which the federal government can encourage and local governments or infrastructure owners to actually upgrade their structures to create less harm to fish and be fish friendly. And that is supported through the Species at Risk Act as well. And then provincially, we've got the Dike Maintenance Act, Section 11 works in and about a stream, and the Water Sustainability Act. DRIPA just came into effect in 2019. We'll be speaking about that more later. Emergency and Disaster Management Act, or EDMA, came into play last year. And of course, most recently, we've got the BC Flood Strategy. Great strategy, no associated funding, so that's a problem. Some of the recommendations that came out of this legal review were to advise municipalities on best practices and best available technology, identify and target the most destructive infrastructure, and that's really some of the work that Resilient Waters has been doing. Explore with municipalities the potential for obtaining control of abandoned and orphaned infrastructure, and advocate for fish-friendly infrastructure funding. So these are 4 of the 6. I didn't put all of them up here, but these are some of the works that were recommended in 2017. And we are slowly and steadily moving towards these goals. So solutions are plenty. We can't say that it doesn't exist. There's a lot around us, and it's almost overwhelming sometimes to think about what can be done. But I just wanted to share some solutions that have been applied in other jurisdictions, be it in the Lower Mainland, across Canada, down in Washington State, or across the world. So some of them have to do with more larger, what we call nature-based or natural defense solutions, like preserving wetlands that we have, or rehabilitating or restoring some wetlands that before it's too late, because they have been proven to be great at mitigating the impacts of flooding. Naturalized stormwater management ponds are living ecosystems, so those should definitely be part of the solutions that are looked at for floodplains. And of course, reconnecting and restoring side channel habitats. So this image I thought is really great because it shows you a mixture of green, gray, and gray technology that could be used to make our communities keep our communities safe, but also enhance ecosystems and ecosystem services. A few others. This is just a great example. This picture over here of a recently created vegetation concrete blocks that has been installed on Cheam Beach along the Fraser River to shore up and ensure that there is a less bank erosion along the Fraser. So I just thought that was a really great example of some green-gray measures that could be used, including the list that I've shared along here as well. And just one example of a project that we were involved in. Resilient Waters will jump into this further, but I just wanted to share out in Lower Agassiz, there's a fish-friendly gate that was installed shortly before the November 2021 floods. I'm sure we will share the blog post and video links to this in the chats at some point, but just to say that this floodgate went from being a top-mounted gate that had failed on the inside to one that's a sluice-style gate that it can be open nearly 90% of the time to allow for more flow of water and movement of fish that increases the water quality and water quantity, because you're not having stagnant water stuck behind the dike, which then, of course, is a hotbed for invasive plants, algae blooms. Invasive fish tend to do quite well in these warmer waters as well. And what we found when the field crew went out the spring after it was installed, or like in 2023, was that salmon were able to once again use these waterways, and this is after over 70 years of being impounded. So that's amazing. This waterway also was one of the few that did not overtop during the 2021 floods. It came online a couple of weeks prior and did quite well in protecting the community upstream. So lots of benefits. And while we're not, like in this specific area, not able to like move the dike back, for example, we're at least able to improve some habitat. We had students come out and plant up the banks and create some riparian in this area as well. So that was a really great project, and one we love to show off. So yeah, so just coming back to this map, I wanted to say that was one of the 186 pieces of infrastructure that need to be addressed. And we cannot be doing this on a one-on-one, one at a time. Hence the need to look at this in a more systemic way and plan in a better way as well. So Deb Carlson will be speaking to that a little bit later. But yeah, we just have a handful of sites in the Lower Fraser over the last few years that have been upgraded to be more fish friendly, but there's so much more work to do. And that is where Resilient Waters came in back in late 2019, early 2020. So the Resilient Waters as a project kind of started when we had this big convening back out in the Sumas Prairie in the summer of 2019. And we called it Resilient Waters Managing Floods for All. And it was we were bringing together, it was cross-sector engagement. So we brought together academics and First Nations and local governments and engineers and community leaders and people who were really interested and keen to learn on how we could better manage flooding in our area. And one of the things that came out of that was we need to identify and restore high priority opportunities in the Lower Fraser region. So with support of the joint federal provincial BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund, Watershed Watch and the Make Way Canada, formerly Tides Canada, applied for funding to start this Resilient Waters project to look at those initial, at the time it was 150, but 186 sites essentially, and do a desktop activity, trying to understand what could be worked on, what was some of those low-hanging fruit in a way. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Patrick will jump into this. But really, what we were trying to do here is look at technical, governance, regulatory, and funding issues. And Resilient Waters has been moving forward and addressing that in a number of really awesome ways. So I'm going to pass this on to Patrick, who will share next on some of the awesome work that Resilient Waters has been doing.
Thanks, Lina. I will I'll hand it over very briefly to Patrick, and just to kind of like reiterate,
Sorry about that.
very soon. No, all good. Just to kind of highlight that, like Lina said, the work that Connected Waters is doing, and then Resilient Waters is more of this kind of intervention in a systems change kind of language, and primarily working on this restoration problem that Lina has been talking about, as well as some collaborative research, and then also some shared learning workshops and webinars that many of you have likely been part of. And there's a lot of overlap and collaboration between the two of us. But now I'll shoot it over to Patrick, the environment sector lead from Kerr Leidal Consulting Engineers, to talk a bit more about this restoration work.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Lina. And thank you for everybody for coming today and spending part of today with us to talk about, to get updated on Resilient Waters. One of the things that I'm most excited about being involved with Resilient Waters is that not only are we advocating for change, or at Watershed Watch is advocating for change, and we're doing research and monitoring, but we're also implementing solutions. And we're doing that in partnership with many of the organizations and groups that are likely on the call today. First Nations, local governments, communities, local diking districts and improvement districts. This takes a lot of effort and collaboration, and it's really exciting to see the network that's come together for this work. So yeah, I've been involved in implementing some of the solutions at particular sites, and KWL's work on the Resilient Waters project started in 2019 with involvement in a prioritization study where we looked at all of the different flood infrastructure that exists within the Lower Fraser from the mouth of the river all the way up to Hope, and began to identify which sites might be most beneficial to address in terms of reducing the impacts of flood infrastructure on fish and fish habitat. And so this was primarily a mix of desktop and field work, bringing together all the existing information. We did a lot of work gathering information from local knowledge keepers, experts in the region, and did a lot of work to try and come up with a priority list of a smaller number of sites of that 186 that Lina mentioned that we could move ahead with. And at the end of the prioritization study, we ended up with 26 high priority sites that we wanted to focus our attention on and try and move forward with implementing solutions. Yeah, these 26 sites represent a range of different types of infrastructure, flood boxes, pump stations, as well as some locations we identified where the dike might be changed or reconfigured in order to improve access to fish habitat. And so we are now moving ahead with implementation of those projects. If you're interested in more information on these 26 high priority sites, you can go to the Resilient Waters website. There's actually a map where you can click on the different high priority sites that we've identified. Next slide. I think this has been covered fairly well, but just to say, again, we know that these off-channel habitats along the lower Fraser that historically would have existed within the floodplain of the Fraser were important rearing habitats, particularly for juvenile salmon that are coming down the Fraser and out migrating to the ocean. And particularly for Chinook salmon, which we know are an important salmon species, both from a harvest perspective, significance for First Nations, but also as a food source for southern resident orcas. And so, yeah, we know these areas in and behind what's now in and behind dikes were important rearing areas where juveniles would feed and grow and hide from predators, learn to hunt their prey. And so the loss of these areas has really had a significant impact on overall productivity of salmon in the lower Fraser. Next slide. And so for each of the 26 opportunities where we've identified an opportunity exists, one of the things we did initially was to develop fact sheets, which highlighted the particular project opportunity, the benefits that would be realized from addressing that opportunity, the potential solution, and who might need to be involved to implement that solution. And so we've been using these project fact sheets for most of the high priority project opportunities to begin conversations with potential partners about how to implement these projects. And so this is just an example of a project I'm going to talk about more in a second, which is a project opportunity on Nicomen Slough, which is on the north side of the Fraser, just due north of Chilliwack, the city of Chilliwack, where we identified an opportunity to address some historic areas that were cut off from the Fraser by a dike and two flood boxes that were also aging and in need of replacement strictly from a flood control infrastructure perspective, but also had the potential to have a lot of benefit for salmon. Next slide. So yeah, just a little bit more about where our initial project was. Again, this is one of the 26 high priority sites that we've been focused on. This is on Nicomen Slough. It's in an area on the north side of Nicomen Slough, quite close to Desroches, and one of the reserves of Lecomel First Nation, who's been a key partner in implementing this project, along with the local diking district, the North Nicomen Diking District, and local private landowners on whom some of this infrastructure sits as well. So this was a project we've been pursuing over the last couple of years and just were able to construct earlier this spring and implement with funding from the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund and the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Next slide. So just to highlight what the problem was at this particular site, these are some before pictures. You can see just how in need of replacement this flood box was. This is a top-mounted flood box, a flood box culvert, a metal one with a top-mounted metal gate. You can see that the gate was virtually on its last legs. The culvert was also collapsing and rusting out in sections. And it was undersized, so our modeling initially showed that it would be unable to handle the projected flow increases related to climate change. You can see it also collected debris and garbage, and yeah, when it was closed, prevented fish access to critical overwintering habitat upstream of the dike. In the summer, some of the monitoring that Resilient Waters has done, and Mike Pearson's going to talk about that monitoring in a second, showed that the temperatures reached in the lake, Joe's Lake, upstream of the dike, were high enough that they could be fatal to juvenile salmon. And there was just poor water quality generally due to the reduced and restricted water flow between Nokomin Slough and Joe's Lake, which promoted the growth of invasive species, some invasive plants, and things like, yeah, American bullfrog in this area. Next slide. So yeah, you've probably seen the animations that Resilient Waters have produced. This is an example of the previous condition at the Joe's Lake flood box. So a top-mounted floodgate with a that only opens when water levels inside the dike are high enough to push the gate open. And so the gate opens only very rarely and so fish can pass only very rarely through the culvert and into the habitat upstream of the dike. You want to go to the next slide, Dan? So conversely, this is the solution that we've implemented at this particular flood box, which is a vertical slide gate that can remain open for most of the year. Probably about 80 to 90% of the year, it can remain wide open for fish passage and will only close largely during freshet when water levels in Nokomin Slough rise as the Fraser River backwaters and flood protection is needed. And so, yeah, we've currently implemented a manual gate, and we're looking to automate that gate with an electrified and solar-powered slide gate in the near future. So here you can see the new flood box culvert and gate that's been installed. Again, it's a much larger culvert. The original culvert was a 900. This has been upgraded to a 1200 millimeter culvert, which adds about double the capacity to convey flows and reduces the water velocity through the pipe further for fish passage. And all of this is improving access. It's improving conditions in the upstream lake for fish habitat and rearing, and for generally to support the local ecosystem. And so here you can see a couple of photos again of the finished project, just finished earlier this year. Next slide. And so one of the most exciting things I think about projects like this is what they lead to. So again, here you can see highlighted in the yellow circle the project we just undertook. But one of the most exciting things that I think has happened is that it spawned a lot of conversation about what can be done to further improve fish habitat upstream within the Joe's Lake area and within this whole sort of diked area. So here you can see a number of projects that we've identified that we could now be pursued as this area has been opened up for better for fish. To further improve habitat. So it includes things like replacing culverts with better, more fish passable culverts on some of the driveways, actually removing some farm crossings that are redundant and could be reduced to a smaller number of crossings, opening up some of these waterways for fish passage. And also just restoring habitat within these areas. There's opportunities for riparian planting to restore more natural floodplain habitat. And again, a group of partners in this area, working in this area that are excited about pursuing these projects. Next slide. And so just to whet your appetite a little bit for the next project that we've turned our attention to, this is Tilbury Slough. This is on the south arm of the Lower Fraser, quite close to the mouth of the Fraser within the city of Delta. And here we've been in dialogue with the city of Delta about improvements to the pump station and flood box at the lower end of Tilbury Slough. Tilbury Slough is a former side channel of the Fraser River that separated Tilbury Island from the main part of Delta, and it was cut off to provide flood protection for Tilbury Island and the city when the dike was built. And so we're looking at opportunities to again make this pump station and flood box more fish friendly and open up the habitat upstream of the dike in this key side channel, historic side channel of the Fraser River. Next slide. So again, one of the things we're looking at here is replacing the pump. This is the traditional sort of or more historic pump type that was used in the Lower Fraser, an impeller pump, much more likely to cause fish mortality when fish pass through an impeller pump, just because of the size of the blades and the speed at which they turn. Tilbury Pump Station has an older style impeller pump, and we're looking to replace it with an axial flow pump, which is shown on the next slide. So this is a more a different orientation of the blades. It spins generally more slowly and allows fish to pass through more easily. It's still not perfect. It still does result in some mortality, but a lot lower mortality than an impeller pump. And I just wanted to also mention at Tilbury, we're also looking so that the floodgate itself is currently a top-mounted gate, and we're looking at installing a self-regulating tie gate, which would be able to be more closely controlled, again, to promote the opening of the gate for longer during the tidal cycle, and therefore allow more water exchange and fish into the Tilbury Slough waterway. So just to highlight, that was just a couple of projects just to highlight the next steps. One of the things we're doing now is to monitor some of these things that we've built and some of the improvements that we've made. Mike Pearson's going to speak in a second about the monitoring that he's doing, ultimately to look at the effectiveness of some of these projects that we're implementing. We're continuing to progress on design solutions for some of the different high priority projects on that list of 26 projects. I guess we're now down to 24. We're continuing to also refine the priority list, recognizing that a lot of these projects are pursued opportunistically and in partnership, and we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of all the opportunities as they arise, and continuing to identify both partners to help with implementation and funding opportunities to fund these projects. They are not inexpensive projects, and so we need adequate funding to move them ahead. And so that's what we're working on, and excited to be a part of this important project.
Nice.
Thank you.
Patrick. Amazing. Yeah, and just to say, anybody who's on the call now and hasn't chatted with one of us about a flood infrastructure opportunity you want to move forward on, feel free to reach out. My email's in the chat there. Lots of ways to get a hold of me, so don't be shy. I'm gonna hand it. So there's as Patrick said, so we've got a bunch of collaborative research projects to show off today, and quite excitingly, Mike Pearson, who's with us, and Pearson Ecological, has been leading site assessments at 26 different sites, the high priority sites, over the past 3 years. And this will be the first time that results from all those will be showed off. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike right now. Mike, it's all you.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Let me just get organized here. Okay, good morning. So we say the monitoring, the effectiveness, of course, these sites, you learned only 2 of them have been constructed, one just a couple of months ago. So what we've been doing really is baseline monitoring. We're getting the current conditions, what's happening at these sites. And that's very important because without that, we can't really judge how effective they are after they're built. You can only do that by comparing what the conditions were beforehand. That seems like kind of a no-brainer, but I'm actually very excited by this project because baseline monitoring is almost never done, let alone 3 years of it. So we've got an excellent foundation for for figuring out exactly how effective this work has been. The field work's been pretty intensive. Over the 3 years, our crews have been in the field more than 250 days. We did fish sampling at 18 of the sites. Most of those were sampled 3 times each year. So before freshet, in March and April, during the high water period, generally May and June, and then post freshet between July and September. And this was done just because conditions are quite different, both inside and outside the dikes in each of these time periods. Won't spend much time on the map, but the little pink dots are the ones that we did the sampling at. There's sort of 2 general groups, sort of the upriver sloughs. This is Ecological slough at Lacamo territory in Nikuman Island. And they are sort of the flood infrastructure. Its operation is driven in these sites more by freshet. There's very little, if in tidal action up here. It's just too far upriver. The elevation's just a little too high. And then further downriver, of course, and the estuary, sort of from Mission downstream, is the boundary roughly. And here the habitats are highly tidal. This are some pictures from Tilbury Slough, where the tide is several meters per day. And so conditions change, certainly outside the dike and often inside the dike on an hourly basis in these systems. There's a variety of methods to capture fish. That's partly because all methods for capturing fish are selective. They will catch more of some species than of others. Those differ between the different types. And some methods can be used or can't be used in some habitats. For instance, you can't use the seines in areas where there's a lot of obstructions in the water. You just snag the nets and it doesn't work. So we use funnel traps everywhere. So these are G traps, and then the larger fetish traps that we make. You can see in the top right photo there. These are baited with chum salmon roe set overnight. We try and set at least 10 of each type inside the dike and 10 outside the dike, depending, and sometimes much more than that. The seines we use, as they say, where we can, where conditions permit. They're very effective and when conditions are good, and especially for catching some juvenile salmon like Chinook and chum that rarely venture into traps for some reason. In the tidal areas, we also use a fyke net. And that's the bottom picture there. And the way that works is you can see it's kind of got lead nets, and then you can probably make out there's a cylinder or a barrel in the middle. It's I don't know, probably 6 to 8 feet long, a couple of meters. And the way it works is we set it at high tide, and then in a relatively narrow tidal channel. And then as the tide goes out and fish are swimming downstream with the current, it basically filters them out of the water. So these, again, can be very effective in tidal streams. And one set at Addington Point, we caught over 16,000, mostly stickleback, in one set in that net. We use data loggers to track conditions of water quality. So the top, that little blue one's a temperature logger. They're quite inexpensive, and we use them at all of the sites. The bottom one, well, the very bottom one's a pen for scale, and then that black logger in the bottom is a water level logger. So it's a pressure sensor that will record water pressure, which then we can convert into water depth. And so that's particularly useful at the tidal sites and to figure out how much freshet is impacting the site. So we use those at quite a few sites. And then the largest one there is an oxygen logger, which are prohibitively expensive, like $2,500 a pop. So we don't use those everywhere. We have 4 of them, and we use them when we're sampling. We strap them into our larger traps and set them at key locations for a couple of days while we're sampling. So that gives us sort of oxygen profiles, usually for a couple of days, at each of those 3 periods that we're sampling: pre-freshet, freshet, and post-freshet at all of the sites. And that's important. We also measure oxygen, temperature, and specific conductivity, which gives us a general index of pollution levels at each trap site. But the oxygen readings for those spot measurements can actually be quite misleading. And I'll show you a graph later on to illustrate that. Because when the biologists are out there measuring it during the day, oxygen can appear quite fine, but then depending on conditions may go close to 0 at night. Particularly if there's a big algae bloom, because the algae is producing oxygen during the day, but consuming it at night, so it drives these big swings in oxygen. Fish, of course, need oxygen all the time, so it's very important for us to figure out if there's none in the middle of the night. During the field work, we worked with guardians and representatives of First Nations and whoever's core territory the structure we were working on in. At Lacamo, one of the studies, it was just a fun and interesting version of that. They had a youth program last year. This year as well, we're working with them. And they came into the field with us to do the sampling. And it's one of the things that I feel really good about with the Resilient Waters program in general, is this connection with the nations, where we're working on the water with them on a daily basis. And that, I think, improves our work through gaining local knowledge and perspectives, Indigenous perspectives, and also really improves the communication, so that their folks are seeing firsthand what's happening as it's happening and have that information. Some generalities. We find, I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics. You can imagine I've got 15 minutes and 18, 20 sites and 250 field days. There's not going to be a ton of detail. But in general, we found invasive species much more prevalent behind dikes and than outside them. And water quality is poor behind the dikes. And that changes seasonally. So let's see. This is Catesy. A second, I'm gonna have to deal with my cat here. My apologies. Just trying to run the show. So this is Catesy Marsh. And at this location, we measured, this is an oxygen logger. So that top panel in the graph, the blue line that waves a little bit, this is in early spring, that's oxygen. The yellow line down below it is just kind of a threshold. So if the oxygen level dips below the yellow line, that's indicating that it's stressful for fish. If it dips below the red line, a lot of them are probably going to die. The lower panel is water temperature. And there, that black line at the bottom is the actual water temperature being measured over a couple of days. And then again, the yellow line above it, if the temperature goes above that, it's going to be stressful for fish. If it goes above the red line, salmonids at least are likely to die. And you can see in early spring, everything's fine. The oxygen's way higher than stressful levels, temperature much lower. So conditions are quite good. During the freshet period, so May and June, it's already deteriorated. The temperature is still fine. You can see it's still well below the stressful levels, but the oxygen levels, particularly at night, are dropping below the stressful level. So the fish are getting stressed for some part of the day. And then later in the summer, sort of July through September, it gets a little ugly. So there, the temperature, interestingly, in this location, close to the mountain, is still fine. But the oxygen is below the lethal level most of the 24-hour period. It just peaks above it during the sunny afternoons, basically. And so that is very typical of, not universal, nothing is in these sites, but very typical of what we find, where in the spring everything's fine, and then relatively quickly as spring advances and early summer, things start to deteriorate, and by late summer inside the dike, conditions are very bad for fish. In the tidal sites, there's, as I said, the tides have an enormous impact over hours. These are those same kinds of graphs. So here you can see oxygen. This is in July of 2021. And so during high tides, oxygen is high, just fine for salmon, and temperature is low, relatively low. It's borderline stressful in July, but still quite tolerable. But when the tide goes out, the water's shallow, it warms up very quickly, and the oxygen depletes of it, partly because of warm water holds less oxygen, and partly because of the decomposing material in there has more of an effect on the low water volume. So, the salmonids survive this just fine. So this is an Addington Point, and during the high tides, we'd be catching salmonids inside. So they ride the tides in, forage in these highly productive habitats, and then ride the tide out before water quality conditions get bad for them. Conversely, we find that the invasive species don't do well in these conditions. As soon as the tide's in, because the salmon are moving all the time, right? They're in here on their way migrating out to the ocean. So, and you might think of it, for a salmon, this is more like an airport, right? It's a place that they pop in on their journey, grab a bite to eat, have a little rest, and then get back on their journey. Where the invasive species are trying to live in there all the time. And so when oxygen and particularly temperature, because the invasive species almost all prefer warmer water, when that temperature is going up and down and the oxygen levels on an hourly basis, it makes it very hard for them. So we find very fewer of them. The fish passage varies widely among structures, as we would expect. Sort of manual gates, which are rare, are open all the time, offer free passage, and you generally find that fish communities inside and outside the dike are quite similar. Side-mounted gates, like the ones at McLennan Creek here, shown here, are also quite good, where, and you see relatively similar fish communities inside and outside the dike, at least close to the dike. As you get further inland, there's often more water quality problems and things change. And the top-mounted gates, it typically very different, right? Outside, we could be catching Chinook and chum and predominantly native fish. Inside, it's typically mostly invasives. The lesson for the salmonids, or the coho and chinook anyway, is that these habitats support fish from over a lot of British Columbia. So the map on the left of British Columbia, every yellow dot there is the birthplace of Chinook salmon that we caught in the Fraser Valley using these habitats, outside or sometimes even inside the dikes. So you can see there, some of those are as far north as Fort St. James, right? And the map on the right shows it for coho, where we've got one from Chilco Lake area, Merritt, all over the place. So just to underline that we're not just talking about local fish in terms of the value of these habitats. It's much bigger than that. Other things that we find are able to document impacts. This is McLennan Creek at Matsqui. And in 2023, if you may recall, the freshet came incredibly early. So the gates closed, the pumps were on before a lot of the coho left these systems. And the picture on the right, taken by Merle Coffin, one of the Matsqui Guardians, it's hard to make out, but those red circles are dead coho on the rocks that have gone through the pump. Through the monitoring work, we were able to identify restoration opportunities. One of the more unexpected ones was at Mariah Slough at Seabird Island. Of course, I think most of you know that there was a major landslide at the north end of Seabird Island in the November 2021 floods, shown here. What was surprising was that the creek that's now flowing through this landslide, it formerly went out directly to the Fraser River. The landslide diverted it into the top end of Mariah Slough, which for years has gone completely dry in late summer. To our surprise, that creek going into the upper end of Mariah Slough is now allowing the upper end to support salmonids. In 2022, there was high densities of coho up there, again in habitat that have been dry for years in summer. Coho haven't made it up since then because there's barriers that the November 2021 floods allowed them past, but they were not able, they weren't able to in subsequent years, but there's still cutthroat up there. KWL is now working with the band, with Seabird to improve conditions there and ensure that there's a permanent connection down into the rest of the slough. This is Backwash Slough at Chiam, where we've one of the things we found with the genetic work was that in off-channel ponds that are isolated through the winter, we were finding coho. And genetic work showed that these were endangered, a lot of them were endangered interior coho. So they're coming down through the canyon. And we find these at some of these upriver sites. And it's overwintering in the valley where conditions are gentler before heading out. So one of the designs that we've been working with Chiam on is both reconnecting Backwash Slough, which is completely isolated, this section, but also digging or planning to dig a series of channels and small pools that we can complex with wood that will hold water all winter long to create more space for these overwintering coho. I won't belabor Agassiz Slough. We, other than to say that we were able to confirm its success. And it was completed in 2021 and 2022 for the first time, probably since prior to 1948, coho salmon overwintered in there. . If you do want the details of particular sites, you can get them on the Resilient Waters website. They've got baseline monitoring report cards that summarize the data for each of these sites over the 3 years of baseline monitoring. With that, I'd just like to thank all that helped us in the field. Our staff at Pearson Ecological, Watershed Watch, KWL, and the and all of the nations that we've had the privilege of working with. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, really great details. Feel free to pop in any questions for Mike into the chat. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time to pause for Q&A at this moment. I just wanted to say a big shout out to Mike for all this amazing work. And I also noticed a couple of former Pearson Ecological folks in the list here, Mike Leon and Natasha Wilbrink, who were part of the Pearson Ecological crew. So a shout out to you guys. So too, Scott Hinch, the lead of the UBC Pacific Salmon Lab. And he's going to present a bit on the new research project looking at pump stations and fish passage.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that introduction.
Okay, over to you, Scott.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a professor at University of British Columbia, and I'm just overviewing some work that two of my students, Stephanie and Hollis, began this past year. I believe Hollis might be in the audience. I think Stephanie couldn't make it today, so I'm doing this on behalf of both of them. A little bit about the Fraser River. You've heard some about it already from Mike, but just to put this in a really big context, for those of you that aren't from British Columbia, the Fraser River is one of the largest rivers in Canada. It's the largest producer of salmon, wild salmon in Canada. It drains about a third of the province. And we're going to be focusing on this little tiny area down on the bottom corner of this map. Same area that you've been seeing a lot of, although we're going to focus in on a couple sites in particular. You heard a little bit about the flood infrastructure. We're looking at here just sort of the pump stations. Now, not all these pump stations are on fish-bearing streams, but many of them are. There's over 170 in the south coast of British Columbia and Washington State. And as you've heard already, juvenile salmon in particular during their smolt life stage are going to be transitioning out of the small tributaries and heading into the Fraser main stem on their route to the Pacific Ocean to start their ocean life history. Unfortunately for them, this is at the same time when water and themselves get pumped from the tributaries into the Fraser main stem as we're trying to keep our landscape drier during the freshet periods. And so they get caught in the maelstrom that is the water being pumped off of the landscape. There's certainly lots of different pump styles out there. There's some that are considered fish-friendly or more fish-friendly than others. These are just 3 examples of that. The mixed flow centrifugal pump, the axial flow pump. Both of these pumps spin relatively slowly. And so the intention is that the fish can pass through without too much damage. On the far one on the right is an Archimedes screw. We call it a pump, although it's not really a pump. It's more of a conveyor of water and fish. But nonetheless, they all have the same objective of moving fish over barriers in a way that is as friendly as possible in terms of the least damage as possible. So we consider what conditions these fish might be experiencing when they come through these pump systems. Well, certainly they share a lot in common with when they go through hydro dams, in particular power generation components of hydro facilities. So they're going to be experiencing some level of turbulence. There could well be pressure changes occurring, which can cause physiological consequences. There's gas supersaturation potentially happening. There's shear forces, which stretch the body. Clearly, there's mechanical injury, whether they're striking blades or striking hard structures that were within the facilities. And so these are all issues that we know a fair bit about for large-scale dams and hydro facilities, but we know almost nothing about how salmon work their way through pump stations. There's been a little bit of work done on acute mortality, sort of the immediate survival of fish going through a pump and looking at external injuries. And it's only been done a few times in Pacific salmon. And what they found is that, the operational speed of the pumps, the size and species of fish, season, affected mortality, affected external injury. But all of these are very acute studies, really not tracking the fish very far away from the facilities. So there really has been no assessments of latent mortality that may arise from injuries that are sublethal at that moment or other physiological aspects that are sublethal until later. And so this is something that we wanted to particularly dive into, as well as looking at some of the more immediate issues that a few others have looked at as well. So the study was to evaluate passage success and look at different risks through the process. So we were interested in examining the prevalence of internal and external injuries and what they look like. Look at both the acute and latent mortality that may occur associated with passage through these facilities. And we really want to get a fisheye view of what it's like to go through these facilities, because if we don't understand what their behavior and passage experience is like, it's really hard to interpret the results that we get. And so we want to examine this experience aspect, and we'll talk a bit more about that towards the end of my presentation. Some classic study approaches that we're using, and we'll hear from Zack shortly about pit tagging that we used a lot on floodgates. We used pit tagging as well, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. These are tags, the person holding one in their hands, the size of a large grain of rice. It's a passive integrated tag so that it transmits a alphanumeric signal that's unique once it passes through some sort of a reader that can charge it and receive the information. We're using them just to identify individual fish. We're not tracking fish with any pit tag readers. This is just a means of looking at individuals for us, so that we can look at injury assessments at the individual level, and then we can look at blood work as well at the individual level. The more latent mortality aspects, we are using acoustic telemetry. So for those of you who know Innovacy or Vemco products, these are V6 tags. On the bottom right corner, you can see a V6 tag in black being surgically inserted. And then here you can see one of the fish being sutured. So this allows us to assess the survival all the way to the Fraser estuary. And we do have receivers also in the ocean, but we're focusing a lot on those that are in the estuary. So here's a map of the receiver system that we have in the lower Fraser River. So each orange dot is a receiver. So we have these receiver pairs. They're like gates, and very good detection efficiency for these for fish passing through these gates to get to the estuary. And as I mentioned, once they're here, there is the potential to detect them on a series of ocean arrays that we have. Although there's a possibility that the tags may run out of battery by the time they get there. So we'll be learning a lot more this year when we see our results. We have 2 sites that we focused on this year, 2 pump stations, Hatsett Lake and Hammersley, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of those in a minute. Hammersley is an Archimedes screw type. Hatsett is a more standard pump design. We also put receivers all around. These are acoustic receivers around the pump facilities. So this is just an example of where we located them around Hammersley. And then we'll be going out and collecting those receivers shortly. And the receivers that are in the Fraser River, they'll be downloaded later in the fall once the water flows are much lower and we can more safely access them. We used fish obtained from the Chehalis River Federal Fish Hatchery for this. So we asked them to raise coho for us for this purpose. It's really hard to find high numbers of local coho that we can access all at the same time for massive experiments like this. So the local hatcheries are really instrumental in a lot of the research we do. So the tagged fish then were released upstream and downstream of the facilities. You want to make sure we're not just placing them upstream, that we're also putting them right down below. So that becomes our treatment then is the facility. We are allowing those acoustic fish just to go off on their own, and we'll see what happens with them. Whereas the pit tagged fish, we attempted to recapture them on the downstream side of the facilities. And so we had a seine set up here, you can see in this image, and then a lot of folks trying to pull the seine in and look at who we got and what their physical situation was. So the reason for doing this is so that we can see what's the effect of our handling, our touching, our netting of these fish, and then we can separate out the effects of the fish pump based on the difference between fish condition that went through the facility and those that didn't go through that we captured just a few meters downstream of the facility. Just a quick overview on the numbers of fish what we were playing with this past year. So in our Archimedes screw site, we let go over about 100 acoustic tags upstream, about 70 downstream. With our axial flow pump, it was about 60 and 60. We released about 70 pit tags upstream of the screw and a lot more downstream. And we didn't get to do any pit tagging for a variety of logistic reasons at the axial flow pump this year. We'll be trying to work through this issue next year. In terms of recovered pit tags, we were able to get 24 back that went through from the upstream side. We got 10 back from the downstream side. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, these might provide some sort of survival estimate. And while it might be tempting to do that, we don't have terribly great efficiency, or we can't claim to have great efficiency at capturing fish downstream in those seines. So I would avoid, even though it looks like, we have much better survival rates for those that were released upstream rather than downstream. I think a lot of this has to do with just the inability to recapture fish that are being released into an area that the net can extend fully across. So let's look, however, more at what these individual fish told us, and we'll look in terms of their physical appearance and other issues, and we'll use the acoustic tag data when we get it to more accurately estimate survival rates. So we're just considering sort of the injury and physiological results, again, just at the Archimedes screw facility. The one thing we noticed is that the ones that went through the facility did have some severe injuries, and they would include some eye hemorrhaging, some nose damage, pop eye, which is another indication of an impact injury or pressure change injury. And then we saw some fin hemorrhaging. This is these are the anal fins. The fish is upside down. You can kind of see some abrasion and bleeding there. So all of these are signs of blunt force trauma. We didn't see this in the fish that were released downstream. Again, small sample sizes. But we also have some physiological support. We did blood work on the fish that we recaptured, and certainly there was elevated levels of hemoglobin in the fish that went through the facility compared to those that didn't, which is an indication that these fish are suffering some forms of injury. Results are still in progress. There's a lot more to go through with our blood work and the injuries assessments, but this is certainly a first high-level overview, and you're the first ones to see this. Okay, I'm actually going to skip this pump animation because I showed you an image of what the Archimedes screw looked like earlier. And I just want to remind people, and this was something that came up in all the pictures that Mike was showing, and that I think Zack will also show, is that, while these pumps or screw devices may be deemed fish friendly, and they may well be very fish friendly as they move through those pieces of hard infrastructure, there's other infrastructure associated with these facilities that have to be considered when we're thinking about safe passage. And I think this is one of those issues. And these grates may not be great for fish. And we tend to use these grates a lot on the downstream side. I'm assuming it has a lot to do with making sure nothing climbs into the facilities that shouldn't be climbing into them. But these grates may be a problem and may be turning fish-friendly pumps into less friendly areas if the fish indeed are impacting these as they're coming through. And you can see the water's moving at a fairly high speed. So it may be really seasonal. It may be have a lot to do with local conditions. And some of these facilities with grates might not produce the same results. But in our situation, we're concerned about what this grate might be doing to the fish, given the injuries that we did see. So what we really want to do now is look a lot more at the experience of fish as they come through. What is causing these problems before you jump to conclusions? So we really need to look at what are called the sensor fish results, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. And we want to look at our acoustic tag data to really get a good handle on latent mortality before we jump to any conclusions. But if this is indeed an issue, this grate, this is an opportunity for what might be a pretty inexpensive retrofit to reduce fish injury. And I think there's lots of ways that we can brainstorm, and engineers are very clever at thinking about ways that we can move fish through these areas without striking these metal grates or minimizing that. So that's something I'm just going to put it out there for people to think about. And I'm happy to receive feedback, and I know our partners are too, about what we may or be able to do in a situation that we have like this. There are other issues that are a lot more out of our control, and certainly Mike mentioned water temperature and the mountain slough, which is where Mike does a lot of work, and also the pictures I just showed you. We had temperatures during our tagging of around up to 19 degrees. Our other facility had temperatures during tagging of up to 21. Now, 21 degrees in the research we've done is near lethal for a lot of these juvenile salmon. 19 degrees is certainly stressful. They can cope. However, oxygen levels are also relatively low in terms of their dissolved levels. So they're getting hit twice by high temperatures and low oxygen, which briefly is not usually a huge problem. However, when the pumps are only operating for maybe 5 to 7 hours a day, of course, it all depends on tidal cycles and freshet levels and other demands of water use. It may mean that the fish are kind of stuck in these areas behind the pumps for lengthy periods of the day, which then puts them under additional stressors, having nothing to do with passing through the pump, but has to do with, being restricted upstream in these conditions that might not be very favorable and unable to get to where they need to get to, where it's a bit more favorable. Okay, the final study approach I want to talk about, and this is what I think is the coolest aspect of the study. The other aspects are really cool, but this is unique in that it's never been used before at this scale. What are sensor fish? Well, it examines the experience of fish through the pumps. They are a small device that's about the size of a juvenile salmon, about 9 centimeters long. They're in a plastic tube. They contain sensors. They have rechargeable battery. They have flash memory. It was developed by the U.S. Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest Lab. They did it specifically to look at fish conditions through hydro turbines. So there's a lot of analogy here of fish going through other pumps, in this case, much smaller pumps and turbines or pumps that kind of act like turbines. It records lots of data on the turbulence, the shear stress, the pressure, the velocity, all the things that we think could play a role in contributing to some fashion to injuring fish. And so this is a device that records instantaneously this information as it transits through the facility. It's neutrally buoyant, so it'll stay underwater like a fish. And then you can retrieve it. I say you program it to float to the surface. It's actually a lot less sophisticated than that. Here are some of the students attaching these inflatable, soon-to-be inflated balloons, the yellow things you see at the end. And so they will inflate within a minute or two after the device is released into the facility. And even if they do inflate prematurely, apparently they can still transit through the situation fine. However, when they do inflate, it means that they're much easier to retrieve. They also have a radio transmission occurring, so we can use a radio tracker to also go out and locate the device and find it and download the data, and they can be reused. The balloons can't be, but the device can be reused and recharged. So we haven't collected any data, really. We've just played with the sensor fish. Our next steps are to deploy these in as many situations as we can. We actually don't have to wait for the fall. We can start deploying them whenever we want, regardless of the water conditions, so we can start to see the range of experiences these fish have to the different aspects of these facilities. We have to recover our data from the acoustic receivers later this fall. And then we're going to repeat these studies and expand on them, we hope to, this coming year. And that is all. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Exciting step. I'm going to check in with Zack. How's it going over there, Zack? Are we getting echoes still?
So I moved over to my phone. If you can allow it to be a host or allow it to unmute, then I should be good.
Okay, have you joined as a phone number? Oh, I see it here. There we go. Okay, I'll make that a co-host as well. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, here we go.
Nice hack. Okay, Zack Sherker, UBC Pacific Salmon Lab on the fish passage at Floodgates in the Coquitlam River. Take 2. Thanks, Zack.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah, so I am a PhD candidate in Scott Hinch's lab at the University of British Columbia, and my PhD focuses on effectiveness monitoring for small-scale barrier remediation, so like culverts, floodgates. And what you can see in this picture is, oh, can you see? You can see my video.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so what you see in this image is 2 pit antennas that we developed on the front end of a self-regulating floodgate to look at juvenile salmon movement through these gates throughout overwintering when they are most in need of access to this habitat. Okay, there you go. I just wanted to start by saying that this research initiative has been a humongous team effort. And we were lucky enough to make a lot of amazing collaborative groups through this work, which was led by UBC and Resilient Waters in collaboration with Coquitlam First Nation and funded by the BC SRIF organization, as well as the BC Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, and then lots of fieldwork assistance from Bailey Environmental and Pearson Ecological, and lots of help promoting the work and the results that we've had through Watershed Watch. And this is just a list of some of the people that have been really critical to this work. So floodgates, I think we all have gotten a good idea of what's going on with floodgates, but basically they kind of come in all shapes and sizes. But the 2 main ones that we see are top-mounted floodgates and side-mounted floodgates. With top-mounted floodgates typically being a bit harder for fish to pass through because it requires a much larger head difference on the upstream end to actually force the gate open and allow water out and potentially fish in. So as you can see, when you look at Vancouver and the lower Fraser River, you can imagine why we have floodgates. A lot of this area that we live in would traditionally be floodplain habitat, which means that it would be inundated at one time or another during the year or during the day in tidally influenced areas. And the way that we combat this is with dikes and floodgates, with dikes being basically big walls that keep the tide water out, and floodgates are basically a means to convey water that builds up behind these gates into the river without allowing water from the river back to inundate those areas that are now protected. And this is just an animation of how a floodgate typically works. But as you can see on the river side on the right and the creek side on the left, when the river goes way down, either during low flow or during low flows in the year, it allows water that's built up on the creek side to force the gate open and potentially allow some fish in or out. And when the river comes back up, either during a rising tide or during a freshet, it pins the gate closed. But unfortunately, these gates remain closed a lot of the time. Their baseline is basically to be closed and allow water out when extremely safe. But as a result, they create a pretty static barrier to fish movement for much of the year. And this is what they look like, unfortunately. And that's probably the most wide open I've ever seen this particular top-mounted tide gate. Most of the time, if it opens at all, it's only by a couple of degrees, and the water flow that comes out of that structure at that time is likely a hydraulic barrier to juvenile salmon movement. So unfortunately, the designs that we used do not align with allowing for fish access. And the scale of the project, I don't have Lina's updated map, unfortunately, but this is just the scale of the floodgate problem in the lower Fraser. So as you heard from Lina, about 186 flood control structures, of which a very, very vast majority are these top-mounted designs that are likely either complete or partial barriers to juvenile salmon movement. But most of the research that's been done on this particular matter has been either led by Mike Pearson or Dave Scott or Seifert and Moore from SFU. But the main goal is to basically see what the fish communities upstream of these structures are and infer passage rates. But thankfully, what we've been doing is is we've been able to actually track these fish through these floodgates to actually see when their approach timing to the structures is, how that influences their passage rates, and how the gate itself is causing a barrier. So a bit more of an in-depth look at how these structures are influencing juvenile salmon access. And as has been mentioned, I mean, juvenile salmon need this off-channel habitat. In the wintertime in particular, I often say, have you ever tried swimming in the main stem of the Fraser River during the winter? And you know, you can only do it once, basically. And so for these fish, it's a very similar feeling. They need to get into these slower moving habitats so that they can survive and grow throughout over winter to grow to an appropriate size that allows them to survive later stages, including estuary residents. So really, really critical habitat. And one solution that we have, because a lot of these floodgates are, you know, we've developed behind them, and now we can't just simply return the land to the floodplain in a lot of instances. And one workaround is basically this self-regulating floodgate. So the way that it works, and there's a couple of different actual designs to it, but the goal is that with either a hydraulic loop or a floaty, the gate is designed to stay open for longer on the incoming tide when juvenile salmon are likely to be approaching the structure, to allow for more water and fish into the system behind, to maintain those low temperatures and high DO levels and allow for fish access. And the gate is designed to basically close at a set height on the upstream end, to basically prevent any sort of inundation or unwanted flooding while maximizing the opportunity for fish to get in on an incoming tide. So a very cool design, but has not been really studied as far as effectiveness monitoring goes. And so that was the real goal of our study when working with Resilient Waters. And so just a quick overview, we set out to assess juvenile salmon passage success and efficiency through 3 different floodgate designs, using pit technology, which Scott showed a couple of pictures of. One of the gates is a self-regulated gate. It is one of 2 on the lower Fraser River. So of the 186 floodgates that we're dealing with, only 2 are of this self-regulated sort of fish-friendly design. We have in the study 1 unremediated top-mounted floodgate, which was constructed over 100 years ago. And we have 1 decommissioned floodgate, which we worked with the city of Coquitlam to basically chain open during winter to allow fish access, to maximize fish access through the remaining culvert, but remains open on all incoming tides during the winter. And the focus was on juvenile coho passage through these floodgates for overwintering. So looking at basically November until spring outmigration in around May. And it's a multiple year before after control impact study. So the design of the study was to not only look at how these gates differ in their fish passage, as well as the particular function of the self-regulating gate. And then in years 2 and 3, which we're coming upon now, the goal was to basically alter the operational regime of the self-regulating gate to see if we could better match fish movements and maximize the benefit of this particular floodgate design in allowing juvenile salmon to access this critical floodplain habitat during overwintering. So a pretty novel study design, and nothing like this had really been done prior to our research initiative. And so just a quick overview of how the study actually works. So this is an overhead view of the self-regulating gate in sort of the center there, and the top-mounted floodgate in our site up to the left. And what we did was we basically had 2 pit antennas that we set on the upstream and downstream end of each of the floodgates. We released fish in batches on the downstream end of each of the floodgates. So we released them in groups of 50 at each site once a week for 10 weeks throughout overwintering, so we could look at how passage may shift or passage success may shift throughout overwintering. And then we allowed the fish to, after acclimating for an hour in the foreground of these these tide gates, we allowed the fish to go free and see if they were able to access the floodplain habitat, or if they weren't, see if they moved around or what they did in the system. So we released 1,500 pit tag juvenile coho salmon, which were all sourced from the Grisgolson Memorial Hatchery, which is just upstream near the Coquitlam Dam. We released 150 fish per week, with 50 fish being released at each of our 3 sites over the course of 10 weeks. And we looked at juvenile coho passage success and movement through these different floodgate designs. And we also collected data on the tidal cycle and the opening and closing of these floodgates to try to better understand how the gate itself is actually influencing fish passage. So a quick overview of the area that we're working in. So we are working in the formerly known as Colony Farm Regional Park on the lower Coquitlam River. And just to give everybody a perspective on the scale of this issue, I actually went to the aerial photography British Provincial Data Bank. They basically have it at UBC, and you can look at particular areas and see if there was aerial photographs taken. This is the oldest aerial photograph on record of the area that we're currently working on, the lower Coquitlam River. So you can see the Coquitlam River coming into the Fraser River on the left. And as you can see, in 1934, the dikes were already up, the floodgates were already in, and the floodplain had been drained. So you can see remnants of tidally influenced creeks in those farm fields, but the rate of degradation that you see behind those dikes would suggest that these gates had already been in for 20 plus years at this point. So unfortunately, we don't have a single image of what the Coquitlam River should look like. But it's a pretty stark reminder of the scale of this issue and the amount of time that we've been having an influence on these floodplains in this system in particular. And on the right, what you can see is actually off to the right, there's a little slough, and that's Reeve Slough. That used to be the main stem of the Coquitlam River before it was redirected with the Coquitlam Dam. So the extent of impact that we've had on systems in the lower Fraser, but in this system in particular, is extensive and it's long-standing. And my goal, as well as the goal of my co-researchers, is to try to help fish get back into these areas after 100 years plus. So when you look at the specific study area that we're working in, this is where we have our self-regulating floodgate that we're studying, which was designed and installed by, KWL and was built by Golden Harvest. Right across the way, we have our top-mounted reference site floodgate, which is representative of many of the floodgates on the lower Fraser River. And then just upstream about 1 kilometer, we have a side-mounted floodgate that was chained open. So that's our basically our reference site. And so because of the proximity of these sites, we actually get a lot of really interesting data from similar from these sites experiencing similar tidal conditions. And this isn't a tidally influenced part of the lower Fraser River. So what we, just a couple of highlights, we had 12 antennas set up at the 3 floodgates, and they operated without interruption from November 2022 to May 2023. And we had over 90% detection efficiency over this time, which is extremely high for pit antennas. We had over 800,000 detections at our pit antennas over that time, which represented about 9,000 passage attempts from juvenile salmon, from the 1,500 juvenile salmon we released. And the vast majority of these attempts were unsuccessful, unfortunately. Another highlight, we were actually able to publish a paper in the Journal of Fish Biology, which outlined a novel pit antenna design that we developed for this study, with a basic overview being that we basically created a polarized electromagnetic field so that these antennas could operate well in the electromagnetic stress of all the metal and the swinging metal doors that are associated with these floodgates, which normally can really, really hamper the performance of pit antennas. This is a very cheap and effective means to actually operate these types of antennas for other researchers to run similar projects in areas that are normally quite difficult for pit. So that was a big thumbs up from our researchers to be able to give back to the research community. And so, yeah, this is just a quick overview of how these antennas are actually constructed and what they look like. And this is what they look like when they're actually in the water operating well, which is nice. So to our results, basically at our decommissioned floodgate, what you can see is passage success amongst the months that our research program was running. So November on the left and May during outmigration on the right. And what you see is blue fish are fish that were successfully detected upstream. So all fish were released downstream. The blue fish are the ones that actually made it through the structure. Red ones are fish that approached but were not successful in getting into the floodplain. And what you can see is that at the decommissioned floodgate that was chained open, a vast majority of fish that approached the structure were successful at getting into the floodplain. So with no floodgate, these fish are approaching the gate, and not only approaching, they are moving into the floodplain, which is fantastic. At the self-regulating gate, you can see that although, quite a few fish are successfully getting into this floodplain habitat, there is still a lot of fish that are not getting in. Which sort of aligns with some of the early research that was done by Mike Pearson and Pearson Ecological that found that basically the self-regulating gate is definitely an improvement, but could likely be further improved to allow for maximal entry into the system. And then our top-mounted gate, as you can see, very, very few fish actually successfully made it past the top-mounted floodgate, even though there was quite a bit of approach. Which is once again indicative of a vast majority of the floodgates on the lower Fraser River. So, unfortunate, but it's good to document these things because this is the first study to actually document the extent at which this top-mounted floodgate is a barrier to fish movement, especially fish that actually approach the structure. And so when you look overall throughout the course of the overwintering, you can see there's a pretty stark difference in passage success rates, and there seems to be room for improvement at the self-regulating gate, but clearly compared to the top-mounted gate that would have been there otherwise, it is a huge improvement to allow for fish movement and access during overwintering. Now, when we look at fish that were successful at getting through these floodgates at each of the 3 sites, what you're seeing here is a breakdown of basically the upstream passage success. So how many times did the fish have to approach the structure before they successfully got in? And what you can see is that at the top mounted gate, on average, fish had to approach the structure over 20 times to successfully get into the floodplain. So as you can see, there's an average upstream passage success rate that's less than 0.10, which means that it's around 0.05 actually, which means that once again, 20 approaches to the gate to successfully get in, which also shows just how badly these fish want to get into these areas during this time of year, if they're waiting so patiently for the right tidal conditions and floodgate conditions to successfully make it through. At the self-regulating gate, on average, fish, the rate was about 0.10. And we find that fish had to approach the structure about 10 times before successfully getting in. And this compares with the decommissioned floodgates, which show that basically fish had to approach 4 times before successfully getting in. So not only are fish having are fish having an issue getting in to begin with, but the fish that do get in have to really, really work. And that's obviously a lot of energy and a lot of exposure to predation, a lot of time spent in the main stem of the river, which is another part of this research. So basically saying, it's not just about fish getting in, it's about how much energy they have to spend to get past these structures. And it's great that we get to take a look at that with this data. And when we look at the tidal height, so basically we were able to sync all of our detections with the tidal conditions at the time. And as you can see in the red is basically a breakdown of when fish were detected approaching the structure. So what you can see is at the top mounted gate and the self-regulating gate, there's a very specific window in the tidal cycle when fish are approaching the structure. And it's on an incoming tide between tidal height of about 1 to 2 meters in height. And you can see there's a difference at the decommissioned gate. It's because that site is about 1 kilometer further upstream. And so there's a delay in the ideal tidal conditions at which the fish will approach the structure. But you can see the movements are based on tidal conditions. So these fish are riding the tide into the floodplain. And when you look at what the fish that were successful at getting in, so on the left in the red is all fish approaches to the structure, and in the blue on the right is the tidal conditions of successful approaches. So when a fish was able to actually get through the structure. And what you can see is that it's lower tidal conditions than the general fish approach. So basically on the incoming tide, only the fish that show up early before the bulk of other fish are able to catch the floodgate at the right condition where they can actually access, after which when the bulk of fish are coming in, the gates are generally closed. And looking at, and this is highly significant just because we had so much data, and it is quite a clear relationship between the top-mounted gate and the self-regulating gate are tidally influenced. So the fish passage success is able to be predicted by the tidal height. And then at the decommissioned gate, you can see they're almost exactly identical. So fish, no matter what time of the tidal cycle they approached, they had an equal likelihood of getting through the structure. So you can see it is definitely an influence of the tide gate itself. And looking at that same data, but in a violin plot, so you can see more of a distribution of when these fish are approaching, you can see there is a bulk of fish that approach at a very specific tidal height. And unfortunately, that mismatches with the successful passage. So basically, we're missing most of the fish. Most of the fish, when they're arriving at the floodgate, the gate is already closed, unfortunately, and only the fish that arrive early are able to get through. So the goal of this research is to basically better match these two violin plots. So basically, when a fish arrives, or at the time when most fish are approaching the gate, we want that gate to be open so we can maximize the benefit of this self-regulating floodgate. And moving on to when fish actually made it into the floodplain, we were able to look at basically how long they stayed in there before they moved out. And it's pretty amazing. So on average, fish stayed 63 days in the floodplain, which probably allows for a lot of growth and a lot of increased survival during that time and overwintering. And you can see that there's a difference in the amount of time that fish spent at each of the sites, with the top mounted floodgate showing that fish stayed on average about 30, 40 days. At the self-regulating gate, fish stayed on average about 50 days. And at the decommissioned gate, they stayed on average about 75 days. A few days, 10 days, 20 days in the floodplain can mean a huge difference in growth and survival for these fish. And likely the reason that these fish were moving out earlier at the top mounted gate and the self-regulating gate is because the function of the gate made it so that the upstream conditions were no longer conducive to their survival and growth. So they moved out early from those sites. Whereas at the decommissioned gate, likely the water conditions stayed reasonable and allowed them to stay the entire duration that they would have chosen to in these off-channel habitats. But it's fantastic for me to see that these fish not only made it into the floodplain, but spent that time there to grow and survive. And it just shows the importance of this off-channel habitat for sure. So clear passage issues for juvenile salmon navigating past the unremediated top-mounted gate, and there seems to be improvement that could be made for the self-regulating gate. Passage success data suggests that the self-regulating gate operations should be tweaked to better match the tidal time of approach of these fish. Fish are following the tides into the floodplains, which is unfortunately when these gates are designed to be closing. So it would suggest that the longer we can keep a gate open on an incoming tide, that is how you're going to improve juvenile salmon access into these habitats. And fish are residing upstream of these floodgates for an average of 63 days, which is amazing to see. So there is a lot of time in their juvenile residency that they're spending in these off-channel habitats, which is definitely going to improve their growth and subsequent survival in the estuary and beyond. And then just a quick overview of our last year's data, which is currently in analysis mode. The self-regulating gate was actually raised 5 millimeters with help from KWL and led by Metro Vancouver, who owns the structure. 1,500 juvenile coho release were released over the course of 10 weeks on the downstream end of the floodgates to replicate that first year of the study. We also released 900 juvenile coho directly upstream of the floodgates, with 300 fish being released upstream of each site. And this is going to allow us to see a better example of overwintering time spent in the upstream area, as well as survival to outmigration, by having a more comparable analysis than we currently had, with only select fish getting in through some of the sites. We were also able to release fish in Reef Slough, which is that off-channel habitat that used to be the main stem of the Coquitlam River, and is currently only connected during freshet. And we were basically working with Coquitlam First Nation to see if we could use that area as juvenile rearing habitat, with the hopes that once it reconnects during freshet, those fish could move out. And we did see some movement out of that site, which I'll be happy to report on in a subsequent meeting. We also did weekly minnow trapping to compare fish community structure, but also look at growth of the juvenile coho through recapture. And we developed a mobile scanning system that you can drag behind a canoe to basically identify areas in the floodplain where these fish are spending time, which is a pretty understudied part of the system, is what are the actual habitat conditions and habitat features that are important for these juvenile salmon at this time of year. And once again, I just want to thank all the supporters and all of the groups that we were able to work with for this project. Couldn't have been done without them. And Coquitlam First Nation for providing guidance, as well as permission for us to do this important research on their land. And thank you, and I'll hand it back to Dan there.
Thanks, Zach. Very cool to see all these results. Yeah, and while we've got this slide up, just an extra thanks to the funders for this project, the BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund, which is really funding almost all of the Resilient Waters activities, plus the Fish Wildlife Compensation Program. So yeah, thanks, Zach. We have one more presentation coming up here from Deb Carlson, staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, on an initiative that Resilient Waters is part of, the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition. More on the systems changey side of things. And then quickly, just before you start, Deb, just because we're running a bit behind schedule, I think we're going to skip the Q&A portion today. So if you do have questions for any of the presenters, do please toss them in the chat, or comments, or feedback. And then at about noonish, a little after noon, we will run into breakout groups. And many of you might run away to go do your lunch or whatever. So, but you're very welcome to stick around. Okay, so Deb, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Dan. I'll just see if I can share my screen. Okay, how's that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So thanks. And I guess I can still squeeze in a good morning by a couple of minutes here to everyone. As Dan said, I'm a staff lawyer, Deb Carlson, at West Coast Environmental Law. And I'm calling in today from the North Shore of Burrard Inlet on the very beautiful and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, and specifically here in the Lynn Creek Watershed, where I'm always so grateful to be an uninvited guest, working and living. And here on the slide, you'll see I'm going to share a little bit about the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition, and these are the logos of all of us that are involved in this pretty much. We're a group of like-minded folks doing work related to floodplain management, and our kind of common goal is that we're seeking a more coordinated, principled, and transparent process for floodplain management in the Lower Fraser region. And really at the heart of this coalition is the Emergency Planning Secretariat, which holds a mandate for emergency management and planning for the 31 mainland Coast Salish First Nations. And usually I'm co-presenting with Mariah Munn, who is the resilience lead at Emergency Planning Secretariat, but she had some other obligations today. So this is who we are. And we're not a formal entity again, we're a coalition. We're just working in alignment. So the work is about floodplain resilience and climate resilience in this Lower Fraser region. And we're supporting processes to identify areas of alignments between First Nations communities and local governments in the region so that we can all work together in better ways with more coordination and really trying to get at these multi-beneficial outcomes. And you've already heard a lot about like the great work that's been going on and the investigation, and this is all connected with the good work that we're trying to support. We're not trying to actually do all the work ourselves, but we're trying to support more of this work going forward and being as coordinated, to say that again, and collaborative as possible. So why do we need to work together in the Lower Fraser to manage flood risks? I think it's probably obvious to everyone, but we do need to do this work. As we all understand, I think that before colonization, flood risks are not new, and the First Nations who've been living here for thousands and thousands of years had many different ways to live with flood and to live with water in the floodplains and the watersheds of the Lower Fraser, and they did so very successfully. In terms of flood events over those thousands and thousands of years, there would have been many flood events, and they developed techniques and practices and ways of living in this region that allow the communities to survive and thrive. But since colonization, we've really focused on one single way of living in the floodplain, and that's like trying to control the water and trying to control flood events. So this has meant diking and damming and creating channels, keeping the water out, and when we let it in, trying to control it in very specific ways. And so it's a lot of construction, a lot of infrastructure. And much of this infrastructure is now outdated and needs replacing, but it's expensive and we don't have the resources to pay for all the upgrades we need. And also we see that when it fails, it really fails quite catastrophically. And in the past, our response has been to, just build higher, bigger, but we're understanding that approach simply, it isn't enough. It can't be the single way that we try to live here in a good way in the Lower Fraser. So again, here's some historic flood events, but more recently, we're of course familiar with November 2021, this large, dramatic, and very awful flood event that occurred as a result of the atmospheric rivers. And occurred as a result of our practices as well. But there are lots of other floods that are always happening as well in our region that perhaps we don't think about so much. Here's Still Creek in 2018, on White Rock Pier, and also in 2018, Stanley Park Seawall in January 2022. So there's lots of different ways that our communities are not well positioned to be in the places where they are located. So it's really encouraging to hear this morning about all the different ways that we can approach things a little bit differently. But we do have to recognize that there is a system in place that supports the status quo flood control system. And really, this system, keeps everything in place, even when we have ideas sometimes about doing things differently. And it's a system of governance, of practice, of funding programs, of regulations and permitting, and also fundamentally of relationships. So I'll try to move through this pretty quickly. And I think most of these things will be familiar to folks on the call, but we have a competitive funding model. We have the silos in jurisdictions. We have really this ongoing sort of project by project approach, which is related to the silos and the funding, but it keeps us just doing the same thing over and over again, kind of in lockstep. We have, because of the way we've approached things, we have gaps in knowledge about the way the systems work, the underlying systems that we're trying to work with, and in relation to which we're trying to manage our own activities. But in terms of opportunities now, we also are in an era of reconciliation when we're working to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have provincial and federal legislation supporting this as well. So it's a good time to be doing this work, and it's also very encouraging to hear about all the research that's being done. So all of this really points to us working better together and having a bigger toolbox of options to manage flood risk. And this is the vision that we're working with the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition, that our floodplains and the people and the non-human relatives, like the salmon that live within them, are healthy, safe, thriving, and resilient to flooding and associated climate impacts. And these are actually some images from Singapore, the Bishan River. And we chose this because we kind of wanted to show that, first of all, there's a lot of work going on around the world that we can tap into for inspiration, and also that this work can be done even in very heavily urbanized areas. So we can figure out different more nature-based ways of working, even in places where we have a lot of people on the landscape and a lot of infrastructure on the landscape. So we also have, taken account of where we are, and we do have a good foundation for going forwards. The Emergency Planning Secretariat has been working for several years developing Ecological, which is a disaster resilience action plan for the mainland Coast Salish nations that they are working for. It means getting together and getting ready together in Halkamalam. It draws on the Sendai framework and also on First Nations knowledge and practices. We have analysis that Lina referred to earlier about the benefits of unlocking 1,700 kilometers of salmon habitat. And we also have the BC flood strategy, which is really reflects more attention, I'd say, from the province on managing flood risk and also redefining the overall approach. And some of the principles that are in that flood strategy include being more holistic, so using this bigger toolbox, being proactive, thinking ahead, so that, planning so that we can make some shifts in the way where we're doing things so that we can be ready for a change in climate. Also emphasizing place-based approaches that make sense for the communities where they're going to be implemented. And finally, it also reinforces the provincial commitments to implement the declaration. We have the Pathways to Action report, which is the outcome of the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy process that was underway from 2014 to 23, and some guidance about next steps from that. Metro Vancouver has formed a flood resiliency committee to bring together the local governments within Metro Vancouver to work on this. And then with the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition, we've been organizing forums for dialogue with First Nations and local government leadership and staff and provincial and federal agencies and even farm associations over the past couple of years. And we had two large regional forums, one in 2022 and one in 2023. And then earlier this year in March, we had sub-regional gatherings in the coastal river tidal area and also in the mid and upriver. And finally, there's also a lot of technical work going on that was carried out by the Fraser Basin Council during the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy process. Also work underway through the LFFC and also work underway through the Emergency Planning Secretariat. So there is technical work that's ongoing that supports multi-beneficial flood management. And finally, last fall, the Ministry of Water, Lands, and Resource Stewardship asked the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition to prepare a draft work plan for regional floodplains resilience in our region. And so we've been doing that, and there's a draft version of that now. So where are we going? Three main areas: strengthening relationships, ensuring we have the information to make good decisions about risk reduction options, and catalyzing nature-based projects. So we want to note as well that in fall, actually it should be fall of 2023, but the Emergency Planning Secretariat has received a good amount of funding to support some work in the coastal river tidal areas of our region through Natural Resources Canada and their Climate Resilient Coastal Communities Fund. This is funding that will go for the next 3.5 years. That's $1.7 million. Putting together that application, there was support from the Provincial Walrus, from the City of Surrey, from Tsawwassen First Nation, from Metro Vancouver staff, and also from the National Research Council. And interestingly, as far as we're aware, the Emergency Planning Secretariat was the only organization that applied for this funding. So there really are opportunities for us to work together and also to do more work on nature-based approaches that aren't being fully utilized, I would say, for our region. So we're hoping to support that. Through that work, these three main baskets, specifically, what are we going to do to work to strengthen relationships? Well, we've had these regional gatherings, the sub-regional gatherings. We're going to keep doing that. So save the date if you're a staff from local government or First Nation or leadership, because we're going to have another round of sub-regional gatherings this fall in November, tentatively November 13th and 14th. Secondly, we're continuing to gather the information that's needed for decision-making. I outlined, we have some of this work already, but we need more information, or we need to do more work to identify what's missing. As we heard back in March of this year from the UBC critical infrastructure expert, Dr. Stephanie Chang, our region really hasn't analyzed or planned for the interconnected risks to critical infrastructure. So we saw this in November 2021 when Highway 1, Highway 7 went out. It was a bit of a gong show, right? And also tragic in some cases. So the third action is really what we've been talking about this morning, is catalyzing nature-based projects. We do have some projects and we have examples underway, but we know from doing these projects that they are a little different than a classic infrastructure building or maintenance or replacement project, that there's more resources that are needed at the planning and design stages, and more of a multidisciplinary approach. So we're looking to find ways to pool resources, kind of like what Resilient Waters is already doing, just keeping that going so that we can get more of this work underway. And we have set up some partnerships with the National Research Council, also with Nature Force, the initiative from Ducks Unlimited that's funded through the insurance industry, and also with the UBC Botanical Garden. So we were happy to have Minister Bowen Ma from Emergency Management and Climate Resilience at the regional forum last year, and she cited the often heard African proverb, "If you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together." And that's definitely a motto for this work. If you're looking for more information specifically about the work plan I mentioned, or the Climate Resilient Coastal Communities project, please feel free to contact Mariah. There's her email, and there's some additional resources as well. So thanks so much for the time. I'm trying to go through this pretty quickly, recognizing that people are ready to go for lunch. But I think our message is that there is, we're here doing this work, and we can definitely, there are so many opportunities to tap into collaboration here in our region that it is, yeah, there's lots of opportunities, and let's keep going.
Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, and thanks so much everyone for sticking around. We are still going to have some breakout groups here in a moment. But before we do that, let me just pull this up. Yeah, just like a quick thanks to all our partners, all our presenters today. Thanks so much for all your help. And then a quick thanks to all of our funders, the BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund, especially Fish Wildlife Compensation Program. The Real Estate Foundation of BC supports most of our work related to the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition, as well as Deb and Lina's work. Lots of other funders involved in that, but not necessarily for us. And then Metro Vancouver Regional Parks Foundation. So with that, for those of you that feel like you're ready to get into some stuff or have some questions you want to ask, I'm going to open up some breakout rooms that you can choose. You'll see the heading of the topic. You're allowed to select whichever room most interests you. I'm going to be keeping an eye on how populated each room gets.